After a longer wait than I would have hoped for, I can finally share details of the next game I'm working on. I would best describe it as a farming simulator in the sky, but there's going to be more to it than just that, which I hope to showcase in more detail in the upcoming devlogs. You play as a character who recently acquired a piece of property in the sky. Above the clouds, you can find a lot of material known as Cetarium, drifting in the wind. Your goal is to collect and sell as much of it as possible. As you obtain more resources, you can find new ways to make even more money and further develop your property. You'll also be able to explore the rest of the world, including the nearby town, learning more about the inner workings of this community. All of the main elements in a farming simulator are here, though of course the main deviation is that you're not harvesting crops on a farm, but instead Cetarium in the sky. The main reason I'm making this game is to try and design an experience that's truly unique for the player, and as I add more features, I'll make an effort to further distinguish the final product. Of course, that's always easier said than done, but we'll see how it goes. Without further ado, let's get started. For my first iteration, I wanted to focus on getting the movement and positioning right. Probably the most interesting aspect of this system is its use of 3D. For the most part, game elements are only represented in 2D, but where it's necessary, certain objects can implement a third dimension, like when jumping for example. This depth value changes where the sprite is drawn, but it doesn't actually change the position of the hitbox, which remains on the ground approximately where the shadow is. This system works well for the most part, but in the future you'll see how it can sometimes cause problems you wouldn't expect. There's not much else to comment on yet, though so far I'm quite happy with how the game is starting to look. The next version makes a lot of key advancements, most notably adding a tile set, more realistic shadows, and the ability to deposit Cetarium. I also added a timer, which doesn't do anything now, but it'll be more important in the future. The feature I had the most difficulty with was definitely the shadows. Part of what makes them more realistic is that they only appear on the ground. They don't appear over the sky because there's nothing there to cast the shadow on. At first I was quite confused with how to implement this, but I settled on a solution that I think is fairly elegant. Whenever shadows are drawn, a given pixel's alpha value is multiplied by the alpha value of the tile set at the same position. This is how the shadow becomes invisible whenever it's not over a tile. This does mean that shadows are rendered separately from their objects, but I think that's probably for the best anyway, since it keeps the code tidier. I continued to work on each aspect of the game, and subsequently improved on the tile set, added a more realistic background, and added an orange tint that's meant to represent daylight, probably around the evening before sunset. Although most of the changes here are visual, I was really impressed with how quickly the game started to look a bit nicer, especially the background. I drew it very quickly, but it's amazing how much a few blobs with a bit of shading can look like actual clouds. In the future though, I hope to make the clouds procedurally generated so that they're not as static as these clouds are. The following version is definitely where I made the most progress so far. I finally added collisions, but I also added better draw ordering, the ability to go beneath the ground, and a daylight tint that smoothly transitions from day to night. For the most part, adding collisions was very similar to what I've done before, and even adding a third dimension was surprisingly easy. All you have to do is specify which types of collisions you process at particular depth values. This means that you can actually move under the ground like you would in a true 3D space. You can't move over objects though, because they're infinitely tall. That's not a limitation of the collision system, however. Adding height values to objects is actually quite simple. The problem is with everything else, like drawing certain objects on top of others, making the shadow respond to the object's geometry, and probably much more. I'm sure I could eventually figure out some sort of trickery to make it work, but for now it's not a necessary feature, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. Speaking of trickery, another problem I had to deal with was how to get the player to draw under certain things. Like if the player exists on a layer above the ground tiles, if it falls into a hole, how can it be drawn in front of some tiles but behind other tiles? I spent a good amount of time thinking about the best way to do this, And although the solution I picked is a bit convoluted, it's definitely effective. Essentially, the player is always drawn above the tiles, but whenever it goes below the ground level, it only draws the portion of the sprite that's still above. It looks a bit weird on its own, but once you add a copy of the sprite that's drawn under the tiles, it's completely seamless. Another drawing issue occurred with the various objects around the world. Since they're all on the same layer, they don't have any defined draw order, which sometimes causes objects to appear in front of things they're meant to be behind. Since I'm trying to represent things that are standing upright, the draw order should be determined based on how close to the camera something is. In my case, I manually changed the draw order so that it starts at objects further up, meaning further back, going down. It doesn't consider how high in the air anything is, since that's irrelevant. I spent more time than I expected on this system, though it didn't take too much longer, and it was nice to finish up something so important and have it work so well. Lastly, I'd like to briefly mention the environmental lighting. It's not too different to how it worked before, except now it changes between two different colors, fading through them according to the time of day. I'll definitely try to improve this system more later, but I think it was good to make a bit of progress now so that I have a better foundation. Overall, the game's still very early in development, though I finished a lot of great work so far, and I'm especially happy with how I was able to create a sense of depth in a game that's ultimately still 2D. Obviously, there's a lot of limitations with it, but it's surprising how far you can improve the illusion with a few simple techniques. As I begin to add more complexity to the game, I'm going to spend less time on drawing and movement, and I'll focus more on world building and game design. That's definitely going to be a nice change of pace, and it might also make the devlogs a bit more interesting. Thanks for watching. Bye.